Hey, it's Merrick. So far, we've looked at HTML and CSS, and we've created an okay looking web page. But now we want to take things up a notch and make the page interactive. This is where JavaScript comes in. With HTML and CSS, once the page is loaded, what you see is what you get. JavaScript allows you to manipulate things on the fly, even after the page has been loaded. So, for example, you can make a pop-up appear when someone clicks on something, or make content appear a few seconds after the page is loaded. Whenever you see a website that has interactive elements, like things moving around or things appearing when you scroll, most likely it's because they're using JavaScript. So we have our HTML document. You already learned that we can add styles by writing them inline within our HTML elements, or by creating a separate CSS style sheet. Similarly, with JavaScript, we can add scripts, which are snippets of JavaScript code, directly in our HTML page, or we can create a separate JavaScript file and connect it to our HTML page just like with our style sheet. Let's start with the first option, where we write it directly within our HTML document. The general rule is that you'll add scripts right before the closing tag of the body element. There are exceptions to this rule that you'll learn later. So we can tell our HTML page that we want to use JavaScript by using the script element. Let's add this to our page. Now, anything we write in this element will be read by the browser as JavaScript. Unlike HTML, which if you remember is a markup language, or CSS, which is a language of style rules, JavaScript is an actual programming language. So this brings with it some new concepts, and in this video, I'll talk about three of them: variables, math, and conditions. In the next little bit, we'll use all these to make a paragraph fade away either immediately or after a delay of 3 seconds. Let's set up this paragraph first. We'll give it the ID ninja paragraph because we're going to make it vanish, like a ninja. Remember, the ID attribute of an element is used to identify it. This is important as we're going to need this ID if we want to manipulate this ninja paragraph element with our JavaScript. So right now, if we load our page, we'll see the word sneaky there. It loads normally. Okay, let's move on to the first concept of a programming language: variables. To explain it simply, they're basically containers that allow you to store data. Think of them as a lunch container that you can put whatever you want into. So for example, I can have a variable called my name, and I can store the word Merrick in it. Officially, we would say we've now set this variable called my name to Merrick. Or I can have a variable called days in year, and I can set it to 365. The key part is that we're naming our variable something that's easy for us to understand. When you see variables called my name or days in year, it's pretty self-explanatory what they're going to be used to store. Another key thing about variables is that you can replace what's in them. Say you want to use the my name variable. Your name probably isn't Merrick, so you could replace it with your own name. Let's say James. That's why it's called a variable. The value that it's set to can vary. You'll see what I mean later on. Alright, let's create a variable in our script. The simplest way is to use the var statement. Now what this does is it tells our code that we're creating a new container, a new variable. Then you want to type the name you want to give it. Since we want to make our paragraph disappear after a delay of 3 seconds, we'll call it delay seconds. This is a pretty descriptive name for what we're going to be using the variable for. Finally, we want to store a value in this variable. Let's store the value 3. We can do this with a single equal sign. We add a semicolon at the end to tell our code that we're done with the statement. So now we have a variable called delay seconds, and it's set to 3. So you can picture a little container that we've labeled with a sticker that says delay seconds, and for now it holds the number 3. Let's move on to the second concept of a programming language: math, like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Here's a list of the symbols we can use in our code to perform these operations. Addition uses the plus sign, subtraction uses the minus sign, multiplication uses the star symbol, and division uses the slash. So let's do some basic math using our variable. We'll convert the 3 seconds into 3000 milliseconds. So first, let's create a second variable called delay milliseconds. Except this time, instead of storing a simple number in it, we're going to store our first variable in it. So right now, as is, they both equal 3. And if I change delay seconds to 4, delay milliseconds will also equal 4. But that's not what we want. If the seconds is 4, the milliseconds can't also be 4. That wouldn't make any sense. So to make it make sense, we need to multiply it by 1000. That's more like it. So 4 in the seconds variable means 4000 in our milliseconds variable. And if we switch it back to 3, then our milliseconds will become 3000. So now we have two variables, and the second one depends on the first one. Whatever amount of seconds we store in our first variable, the second will automatically multiply it by 1000. Notice that we have to write this line after we created our first variable. By default, JavaScript reads from top to bottom. So if we want to use a variable inside another variable, it has to exist first. If I flip these two lines around, for example, now delay milliseconds is referring to delay seconds, which doesn't exist until later. So this won't work. Let's put it back. Now, you might be wondering why we're doing this. Can't we just set delay milliseconds to 3000 and get rid of delay seconds? You'd be right, we could actually do that. So I could just delete this and set delay milliseconds to 3000. The code is still the same. But the reason I did it my way is because I wanted to show you that we can use math to set variables. Another benefit of this is that it gives more meaning to our code. It's a little easier to think in terms of seconds than milliseconds. So if we just want to change 3 seconds to 5 seconds, we can change the 3 to 5, rather than changing 3000 to 5000. In this example, since we're just dealing with seconds and milliseconds, it's not that big a deal. But code can get pretty complex, so sometimes it's helpful to keep things in units that are easier to understand. Now, onto the third concept, which is conditions. It's what allows you to apply logic to your code using conditional statements. And at its most basic, we have the if and else statements. I'll use an example to demonstrate how an if-else statement works. Imagine you were building an extremely basic version of the Terminator. And I mean really basic. You could use a statement like this. If target equals John Connor, terminate target. Let's break this down. Say this program runs whenever our Terminator encounters a target person. First, it'll evaluate the condition. In other words, is the target John Connor? If it is, then the program will run the code that corresponds to the if statement and terminate the target. But what if the target isn't John Connor? We want him to move on to another target. This is what the else statement is for. It could look something like this. It'll basically handle every scenario that the if statement didn't. Now, you probably already noticed, but the code that we want to run is written in the curly braces right after the conditional statement. So, in plain English, you could read it like this. If the target is John Connor, terminate the target. Else, or otherwise, find a new target. Now, a Terminator running this code wouldn't be very good at its job, as it would basically ask every single person in its area if their name was John Connor, which would probably give John plenty of time to run away. But you get the point. Alright, now that I've used up all of my imagination, let's get back to reality, and we'll use an if-else statement in our code. We can set a new variable called delay, and we'll set it to the word no. Now we'll write an if statement that says, if the delay is no, set delay seconds to 0. Else, set it to 3. Notice that when we're setting the variables here, we don't need to use the var statement. That's because you only use var to declare a variable for the first time. After that, the page already knows about it, so you don't need to declare it again. So what we're saying is, if our delay variable equals the word no, there will be no delay. If it is anything other than the word no, then we'll have a delay of 3 seconds. It's basically our on-off switch for whether we want a delay or not. One thing you may have noticed is that we're using a single equal sign when we set our variables. So here, 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 and here. But we use 3 equal signs in our condition, here. This is important because in JavaScript, the number of equal signs you use will make it do different things. If you use a single equal sign, it will set something. So whenever we want to set our variable to a value, we use the single equal sign. This is different than how we want to use it in our if condition. Here, we want the equal sign to compare 2 different values. We don't want to set it here. We just want to check whether it equals no. So 3 equal signs is to compare things, and a single equal sign is to set things. Let's see how our variables, mathematics, and conditional statements come together to make this work. We've already set up the element we want to manipulate, our ninja paragraph. If I load up our page again, it just shows up normally. It's not being a ninja, and it's not fading away. We're going to need to use a function to do this. All you need to know about a function for now is that it's like a factory machine that will perform a set task. And much like a factory, you have to input some raw materials in it, then it'll process it, and then spit out something useful. So if you're using a factory to can some beans, you have to feed it metal and beans, and then it does some processing and spits out a thing of canned beans. Most languages have a bunch of built-in functions, but you can also write your own custom ones. We're going to stick with built-in functions for this, and I'm going to be using one called setTimeout. This function takes 2 raw inputs, just like our bean machine. The first input is the code we want this function to run. The second input is the amount of time, in milliseconds, to wait before running that code. And we separate the 2 inputs by a comma. So if we give this function 1,000 for the second input, after 1 second, the code in the first input will run, because 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. But what do we feed our function for the first input? We want it to do 2 things. First, we want to grab our ninja paragraph. Then we want to make it fade away. This is where the ID attribute of our paragraph element comes into play. That's how we can tell our code, specifically, which paragraph to grab. We're going to have to use another built-in function to do this. This one is called getElementById, and it takes a single input, the ID of the paragraph we want to get. Since we want to get our paragraph element with the ID ninja paragraph, we're going to give it that as the input. Now, we also have to specify where to look for this element, so we have to add document dot in front of it. Don't worry too much about this for now, but basically document refers to our entire HTML document. Okay, so with this bit of code, we've grabbed our paragraph element by its ID. Now we want to add some more code to make it fade away. Again, don't worry about this for now. The important takeaway for you here is that we can use an element's ID in JavaScript to grab it and then manipulate it. So let's add this to our code. Right now, we've written 1,000 as the time for our setTimeout function to wait before making our paragraph fade away. But what we wanted to do was either have it disappear immediately or after a delay of 3 seconds. Remember, we've set some variables with our if-else condition, So let's use them. So instead of 1,000, let's replace it with our delay milliseconds variable. Let's go over what will happen now. Our delay variable is set to no. This is our on-off switch for whether we want a delay or not. Since it's set to no right now, in our if condition, it checks to see whether delay equals no. And it does. So it's going to run the code corresponding to the if statement and set delay seconds to 0. Remember, JavaScript reads from top to bottom. So even though we declared our delay seconds to equal 3, we're now resetting it to 0. And now, since our delay seconds is 0, 0 times 1,000 is still 0. So our delay milliseconds variable will be set to 0. Finally, our setTimeout function uses delay milliseconds as the amount of time it's going to wait before running our code to make the Ninja paragraph fade away. Since it equals 0 right now, it's going to fade away immediately. Let me show you. So as you can see, it's fading away as soon as the page reloads. Now let's change our delay variable to yes. Now in our if statement, since delay does not equal the word no, it will run the code in the else statement and set delay seconds to 3. This means our delay milliseconds now equals 3,000 milliseconds. So if I refresh the page now, we'll wait 3 seconds and then the paragraph will fade away. So our code's all working now. If you remember at the beginning of this video, I said you can either write JavaScript directly on your HTML page, or just like with CSS style sheets, you can use a separate JavaScript file and then connect it to your HTML page. Let me quickly show you how you can do that. Let's create a new file by clicking the new file icon. We'll call it javascript.js. Now let's take all our code within the script element and paste it in that new file. Finally, we'll use the src or source attribute on our script element and point to our new javascript.js file. Now our code is nice and organized. Our JavaScript is tucked away into a JavaScript file, just like our styles are tucked into the style sheet. So as you can see, we can use JavaScript to dynamically add content into an element, set up delays, and create pop alerts. But this barely scratches the surface of what it can actually be used for. Since its creation, it has become much more than a language simply for manipulating your page. Entire applications and mobile apps have been built using JavaScript, but that will be a topic for later. I hope you learned something from this video. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you want more content like this, subscribe.